welcome to Dignified Resilience. I'm very excited for today's conversation and grateful for both work and time that Dr. Bruce Perry, my today's guest, has invested in the topic of resilience, and particularly in developing a perspective on childhood adversity and its impacts that I much appreciated and which resonated with me, and surely with a lot of the experiences and those of many others, people that I know, whether they're friends or family or colleagues. Before welcoming him, allow me to introduce Dr. Perry. He is the principal of Neurosequential Network, senior fellow at the Child Trauma Academy, and adjunct professor in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine in Northwestern University in Chicago, as well as the School of Allied Health at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Perry has been an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. His work on the impact of abuse, neglect, and trauma on the developing brain has impacted clinical practice, programs, and policy around the world. Dr. Perry is the author with Maya Slavitz of The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a best-selling book based on his work with maltreated children, and Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. Dr. Perry's most recent book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing, was published this year, co-authored with Oprah Winfrey. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller, and I keep seeing online that at the end of this year, it's picking up awards as the best book on various platforms. And Dr. Perry has published over 500 journal articles, book chapters, and scientific proceedings. He's the recipient of numerous professional awards and honors. I do not want to skip the biographies. No, this is important. These things are important.
You're making me blush.
No, there's so much that I want to talk to you, Dr. Perry, and I'm sure that the conversation will be so beneficial for so many listeners and viewers around the world. So hello, thanks for being here. Welcome to Dignified Resilience. How are you today?
Well, first of all, thank you, Riada, for having me. I'm very honored. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to talk to you and your audience because it is so international. And a lot of times I end up just talking, you know, it's sort of like an echo chamber. You talk to people who think like you do, who look like you do, and come from your background. And so I know that you have a very wide and diverse audience. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So great. Let's dive in. I got in touch with you after I read your book, What Happened to You? And I learned from it that Oprah and you have been talking about trauma and the brain and resilience, and you've been obviously working about it on the healing as well for more than 30 years. And as you say, this book is in many ways the culmination of those talks. So tell our listeners, how is it that, as you write, the title, What Happened to You, makes and signifies a shift in perspective that kind of honors the power of the past to shape our current functioning? Why is that the key question if you want to understand someone?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know how it is when you grow up and you just think the world is a certain way, and you really don't, you know, everybody you meet, you kind of think, well, they must think the way I do. And so I have to admit that this question about focusing on the importance of history, either the history of a people or the history of a person, as being important to how they function in the present, has always been part of the way I've thought about life. I grew up in North Dakota, which is a very rural state in the US. And I just was part of a family that had been settlers in that, you know, pioneers in that community. And I was acutely aware of these transgenerational phenomenon. You know, my great grandfather was a sheriff, and my grandfather, you know, had another role in this small community. And so I just was always thinking about history. And I wanted to be a history teacher as I was growing up. And but I was also very interested in biology. So I started to recognize that development, you know, the process of becoming a full organism, whether you're thinking about, raccoons or birds or people, starts, back as a single cell. And then that cell divides. And then there's influences on how different systems organize. And so I was always tuned into that. And then when I went to college, I was very, very fortunate to have a professor who was studying the impact of stress on the development of the brain. And he had really by accident discovered that a very, very brief experience of stress at the right time in the early life of an animal, he did this with both primates and with rats, but just a 5-minute long experience would impact the way that animal grew up. And I was just fascinated by that. So from that point forward, I started thinking about, recognizing that the present functioning of a person or the child or somebody who I was interacting with was profoundly impacted by what had happened to them. And it's funny. I mean, this 30-year relationship I had with Oprah, all of these conversations I had with her about different aspects of trauma, the impact of sexual abuse, how we should solve problems about community violence. There were all kinds of things that we talked about. And it was finally after she finished her show and was no longer doing her show, she became a correspondent for 60 Minutes and did some special topics. And she was doing a special topic about a program that helped people who were traumatized in Milwaukee, which is part of where she grew up. And they happened to say, hey, we're using, a program that in collaboration with Dr. Perry. And she said, oh, I know Dr. Perry. So she called me up and said, do you want to be on this, talk with me about this work? I'm like, I guess, all right. So we had a conversation, and she was relating a story about one of these kids who had been given all kinds of opportunities, but had kind of blown the opportunities. He was given resources, he was given additional tutoring, he was given, all kinds of things. And she kept saying stuff like, well, what's wrong with him? Why wouldn't he take advantage of that? And I said, well, the real question shouldn't be what's wrong with him. It's like, what happened to him such that he can't take advantage of that? And the funny thing was that phrase immediately crystallized for her all of these conversations we'd been having. And it made me realize, first of all, what a bad teacher I had been. I spent 30 years telling her this stuff, and she really didn't get it until I sort of helped her sort of shift her perspective a little bit. And then it just was like an aha moment for her. And from that moment forward, we could have much deeper conversations about things. And anyway, so what happened was that her publisher saw the 60 Minutes piece. And my conversation with her, I think, was less than 90 seconds, or how that is on television. They just turn it into, they'll tape you for 3 hours and then they'll have 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Right. So he asked her, he said, do you think he'd be willing to write a book and for us? And Oprah asked me, and I said, I don't know, Oprah, I already wrote a book about this. And I said, the reason people will listen to this, you'll reach more people if you write a book about it. And she said, I don't know anything about this. I said, well, yes, you do. We've been talking about it for years. And at one point we finally just said, well, why don't we both write the book?
Yeah.
And that's how it happened. So
thank you for sharing that creative part of this collaboration. I think that, as you said, that switch from what's wrong with you to what happened to you might seem very easy for those who have been dealing with it like you. But for us as readers and the outsiders, or let alone those who have experienced it, it's such a relief that it's been put out there now so that we could really shift conversations and change the way that we talk with people and ourselves. And I will get back to this in our conversation, but I think that it's important to also clarify, as you do in the book, even as little as 20 years ago, trauma was never really considered a factor in a person's health, as we learned, which was also wow for me, because now, or maybe because I use it a lot, it seems it's been out there for a while. And it's obvious it leads to those of us who work or study or encounter people who've experienced trauma, let alone themselves, how it's so underappreciated in mental and physical health, and in the workplace, in politics more broadly. And you yourself write that the complexities of trauma impact all of our systems. But can you please tell our listeners what you mean when you use the word trauma? Because we hear it a lot, but many people still don't have a clear understanding of its true definition, if that even exists.
Right. No, Riada, you're touching on something that's so important for our field. And that is that everybody does use the term, right? I mean, you hear people in the grocery store talking about, and so it's important to be clear about what we mean when we're talking about it. So the easiest way to kind of explain it is to remind people that your body has all these systems that help you manage stress, any challenge. When you get hungry, your body responds a certain way. If you run up a bunch of stairs and you get short of breath, your body responds a certain way. And there are systems in your body that help you do that. And so running up a bunch of stairs when you're out of shape like me is a stressor.
All of us. Yeah.
Yeah. You'd probably have to run up more stairs than me to get stressed. So, but anyway, but what happens is these systems are continually working to help us make our way through the day and thrive and survive. And there are certain patterns of challenge, of activation of the stress response that lead to more chronic changes in how well these systems work. So I'm kind of giving you this long explanation because this is also a good way to understand resilience. Because it's interesting, trauma and resilience are kind of, two sides of the same coin. Both of them involve the systems in our body that are involved with stress. One pattern of activation of the stress response leads to stronger systems and what we call resilience. Another pattern leads to weaker and more vulnerable systems, which lead to trauma-related risk for physical, mental, social health problems. And the challenge to all of us is to see in the way we parent, in the way we are with our partners, in the way we are with the way we do our work and everything else, can we create systems and environments where there are more resilience building stressors than stressors that wear people down and wear people out and make them sick. But basically a trauma is any pattern of activation of the stress response system that leads to a change that makes that system more vulnerable. And, and as you're thinking about that, there are three, we use the term, the 3 E's, that there's the event. So let's say that the event is, I'm going to give you 2 examples. One event is a clear thing where everybody go, wow, that's pretty bad. Let's say school shooting, right? So if you're in a school shooting, most people can go, wow, that seems like that would be a traumatic experience. But not every child in that experience, in that event, has the same internal experience. Some children were closer to the violence. Some people were further away from the violence. So the way the body responds to that is going to be important. So that there's 2 of the E's. One's the event, then the experience, and then there's the effects. So the people who are most impacted by that, have this high prolonged activation of their stress response because of the event. They will end up having being more sensitive. They'll have a harder time with
Mhm.
transitions. They'll be more inattentive. They'll start to wear down their heart and their lungs. And so they're the ones that become more vulnerable to
Mhm.
problems. Now that's kind of an easy way to think
Mhm.
about it. Now here's the one that's more subtle.
Okay.
Let's say that you are a child who has autism,
Mhm.
and the event is going to a birthday party.
Okay.
For that child, that event doesn't, most people go, a birthday party should be
Party.
fun,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But because of the way he's organized,
Mhm.
his brain can't handle
Mm.
all of the sensory input and all
Mhm.
of the noise and complexity. So it activates his stress response in extreme ways. And his internal experience of the happy birthday party is
Mhm.
negative. He feels
Mhm.
overwhelmed. And then that child will start to do self-regulatory things like rock and self-stimulate,
Mhm.
and might even sort of be behaviorally explosive. And because that system has been activated in that way, that will be contributing, excuse me, to the long-term effects that for that child, that the next time he has an opportunity to do something social, he'll go, oh, no, 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 no.
Mhm.
And so for the child with autism, a birthday party can have a traumatic effect, which sort of
Wow.
seems bizarre,
Yeah.
but that's what can happen.
Mm. And that makes everything so much more, I mean, the nuances that you describe show how almost difficult it is to, and how careful we need to be when we talk about this and when we deal with individuals, precisely because almost every single individual experiences a bad event in a different way, right? um
Exactly. Exactly.
it's so complicated to think about it,
Well,
because we want to make a formula, but now we see
yeah.
it cannot be a formula. Well.
Right. That's such a good point. And that's why our work
Mhm.
continually focuses on getting to know the individual
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
So let's say that you are, I mean, I noticed that you have an accent, right?
Mhm.
So there have been times, I'm sure, where you've been in an environment where the moment you talk,
Mhm.
there are people that will look at you like you don't belong here.
Mm.
Or you get these nonverbal signals that,
Mhm.
like, not necessarily
Yeah.
of rejection, but sort of like questioning.
Yeah.
And so when that happens to you all day long, it
Mhm.
wears out your stress response
Mhm.
system. And so this is one of the challenges of being of understanding these issues, right?
Yeah.
So as you say, there's no simple formula.
Mhm.
And the key, I think, is kind of what you know you said earlier. We have to be careful,
Mhm.
and we have to be respectful
Yeah.
as we meet new people, because we don't know their
Yeah.
story, right?
Exactly.
You just
Mhm.
never know what somebody might have, what their story
What
is.
happened to them, right?
Exactly.
Well, I'm a mother of 3 kids, and the youngest one is 7 months old, a baby. And it was
Love
important
babies.
timing. Yeah, they grow up too fast.
I know they
But I'm
do.
grateful that I can get some sleep at night now. So, what was incredible, well, one of the many things that I appreciated is, and you mentioned it briefly, to understand how the timing, I mean, the experiences in the first years of life are so disproportionately powerful in shaping how our brain organizes. And if you
Yeah.
can, I would
Yeah.
appreciate if you could talk a little bit about it, because and I'm referring also to those findings that the timing of adversity also makes a huge
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah.
And when I just read it, then I got so depressed. I was like, oh my God, so many people are messed
No,
up. But
no,
then it
no.
gett better towards the end of the book. But
It does
I
get
think
better.
it gets better. But it is important to understand how the younger you are, the more you depend upon the caregivers. Can you
Right.
tell us a little bit more about this timing, and how when we're babies almost, it's crucial?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I again, I just want, and just I'm going to remind you
Okay.
that as overwhelming as it may feel as a young parent, that, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I have this responsibility in every little
Uh-huh.
thing I do. Just remember that this is also this tremendous gift, right?
Mhm.
So your kids have absorbed all the good things about you, You know, they absorb like a little sponge, your kindness and your tenderness and your intentional efforts to, you know, and we get it wrong, right? I mean, the beautiful thing about healthy development, and you know, this is going back to what I said earlier about the pattern of stress.
Okay.
When you have a caregiver who is interacting with you and you get hungry, thirsty, cold, or whatever it is, you're activating your stress response. And they'll come and they'll regulate you and feed you, and then your stress response goes down. And so when they want, your little one wants your attention, they kind of get fussy or a little bit upset, and then you give them attention and they go, oh, that's awesome. And then you have to pay attention to one of your other kids, and they're like, hey, what about me? What about me? And so the very nature of healthy human interactions that build resilience is that they involve rupture and repair, rupture and repair. And so a lot of parents are hard on themselves because they think that they should always be so there. And you just need to recognize that it's these little doses of dysregulation. They're not terrible for kids. They're part of it's like weightlifting, right? Or doing interval training. If you want your kid to be, your child to grow up, or you to be a better runner, you have to sort of run hard and make yourself distressed and breathe hard and sweat, and then you rest. And then you do it again, and then you rest, and then you do it again and rest. And it's the same thing with all of these developmental things. So I hope that the people who are listening don't beat themselves up because they weren't perfect. The brain and healthy development does not want perfect. The brain wants little imperfections. It wants little challenges. That's how we grow. That's how we get better. Anyway, so back to that point. So these systems I talked about earlier that are involved in stress, there are many of them. Some of the most important components are in lower parts of the brain, and they develop early in life. They begin to develop while you're a fetus in utero, and then after birth, the baby gets challenged, right? It's like, wow, I've never seen things, I never heard things, I've never been this cold. You know, all of these things are stressors, but fortunately, there's this caregiving environment, mom, dad, auntie, you know, everybody who can come in and provide touch and feeding and warmth and all the stuff that helps us grow up. And it is that pattern of activation, regulation, activation, regulation, activation, regulation that builds these systems to start sending normal organizing input to undeveloped parts of the higher brain. So the brain, if you know, in the book, there's this drawing, right? This upside down triangle drawing. And so if the listeners can envision an upside down triangle, and at the bottom of it are these regulatory networks, and they're sending little sort of roadways, little pathways up into higher parts of the brain that are undeveloped. And the signals that those lower systems are sending are really important in organizing these higher networks in the brain. So here's the dilemma and the gift. If in the first couple of months, as exhausting as it is, as hard as it is, you're attentive and attuned, and then when the baby cries, you come and feed the baby and you hold her and you rock her, and they drive you crazy and they take a bunch of energy. But what you're doing is you're building a resilient stress response capability. Amazing. And so the more you do that, the easier it is for them to tolerate a little bit of absence when they're 3 months old, and then a little bit longer when they're 5 months old. And when they're 7 months old, they cry, but they know you're going to come. They know you're coming. You know, they know, all right, they actually see how much crying before you come, but they're healthy. Now, the downside is if you've got an overwhelmed caregiver, and you've got, or a child who, God forbid, is neglected or abused, those systems that are organizing in the first couple of months of life, start to send abnormal signals.
Mm-hmm.
And even if at 3 months of life, they get into an environment where people are safe and protective and caring for them, they still have this major organizing system that's continuing to send abnormal signals to their developing brain. And so they're continue to be at risk, even though they're no longer in an environment that's negative.
And as you've been now talking, and while I was reading the book, it made me also think how important and how almost it is a luxury for adults and caregivers to know themselves in terms of the parent with a childhood trauma and the consequences that might lead towards, just caregiving as well. Or I was thinking about children born out of sexual violence. There's a lot of it in Bosnia, where I'm from. I was thinking about the circumstances that end up, putting both parents and these kids in environments that maybe these caregivers, it's not that they didn't choose, but that they wish were different as well. And
Exactly.
how important it is that we are aware of how you said almost fascinatingly that it changes the brain of these infants, that it impacts the brain. That is incredible, and why I think we need to keep talking about this in the impact of trauma on adults and humans in general. But if I tell me, so if I'm getting correct, and to also clarify, we have been talking about the stress responses, and is it then that when the stress response systems are activated in unpredictable or extreme ways, that's what kind of becomes overwhelming?
That's exactly right.
But that when it's predictable and I'm not going to say normal, but what should be the word? Moderate, then that's what is okay.
Right. Exactly. That's okay. And so, for example, how old are your other children?
6 and 4.
Okay. So your 6 and 4-year-old are probably having experiences where they're challenged every day, right? There might be a new routine in school, or they may go on a field trip somewhere where there's a bunch of new things. And so that's a little bit of a stressor, but because they're with people that they know, and there's there's relational safety, they have this challenge, and then it's over, and on the bus back home or the car back home, then they feel regulated, but they've had this challenge. It's predictable because they've been told, we're going to go to the museum, or we're going to go to wherever, and there's an element of excitement. And it's interesting when you are in an environment where you see people who are your safety anchors, activation of your stress response is interpreted as excitement.
Okay.
If you are in the same environment, but you don't have any of those anchors, you interpret that same activation as fear. And so this is one of the things about a healthy developmental environment, right? It's good to challenge our kids. There's nothing wrong with sport, drama, music, band. When kids learn to do their recital, it's stressful to perform in front of other people. But really, once they do it, that's a level of sort of that gives you confidence. I've had success with this challenge. And you learn to tolerate a little bit of internal discomfort, which means the next time you have a new thing, you're not as overwhelmed, and you'll feel a little bit more comfortable, and you realize, I can do a new thing and not get totally overwhelmed. And this coupled with curiosity, the ability to tolerate a little bit of discomfort, really leads to this wonderful, healthy developmental trajectory.
As I parent every day, about my own childhood and those of my friends, and I am on one hand so grateful that I am in a place where they have physical safety, first of all, and everything that can come after that. But how many people and kids grow up not having that as the first basis of being able to build this resilience the way that you do. And in the book, there are beautiful, easy to understand graphs, and it was beneficial for me to see it in the way and how you describe how someone with a sensitized stress response will respond to even moderate stress with a terror response, as well, and how that shifts as well, and how that contributes to overall health. And I don't know, did you ever think about it? But I thought about this when I read that when you write that if you grow up in a household or in a community which has that unpredictability and chaos, and that right, that you will have this changed response system. I was thinking about, can we say that for a country even? I mean, like how we define a community is like micro to macro. But I was thinking about this pattern of stress activation. I was thinking, I mean, I'm writing, yesterday I was talking in a program about whether Bosnia will split up again. We're talking about a country that's been through a genocide 26 years ago, and we are discussing whether part of it will secede or not. And I said yesterday, well, let's also, besides talking about policy, remind people that these are survivors whose trauma has not even properly been acknowledged. They haven't even had proper the perpetrators have not reckoned with it properly. And then you have, from the most micro household to the neighborhood, to community, to a country. And I'm thinking how we're not talking enough about the consequences and impacts of this on functioning as individual citizens, contributors to, I don't know, this sounds horrible, but even like to company, to economy, to a country.
So first of all, Riada, you are absolutely spot on with understanding that human history, you know, the creation and dissolution of nations, the process of creating trade and treaties, all of human history has been impacted by these phenomena. And if you don't understand these phenomena, there will be all kinds of repetitions in the way we try to solve problems. I'm actually working on a book right now about that very thing, about how do you take these concepts and apply them to organizations, to groups, all the way up to nations? Because you're absolutely right. There are certain nations that have a critical mass of traumatized peoples. And if from these people come the artists, the poets, the sculptors, the leaders. And what you find is that in all of those domains of functioning, there is some echo of the trauma. And you know, many years ago, I was lucky enough to have an experience where I was at the University of Chicago, and there was a historian named Richard Helly, who was an authority on Russian history. And one of the things that he had been studying is what's referred to as the Russian Dark Ages. And what it was about a 200-year period when there was incredible repressive and oppressive violence. And during that time, there were almost no poems written, no books written, no productivity, no creativity, but incredible violence. And when he read an article that I wrote about, and we talk about this in the book, that what we call state-dependent functioning, that when you are in a state of fear, big parts of your cortex are just not easily accessed. And since the cortex is the most uniquely human part of us, you're more likely to engage in inhumane worldviews. It's easier for you to demonize other people. It's easier for you to do things that are brutal, that are not very rational, that are sort of driven by fear and emotion. And we see this happen. This has happened in history again and again and again and again. So I think, Riada, you're absolutely spot on that if our leaders and the people involved in foreign policy, involved in sort of creating internal national policy in every country, knew some of these things, I think that we would create better practices, policies, and law. I think we'd be better. And I think it's possible. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm hopeful that by the time I'm dust, that these concepts will be more widespread in the population. And it may take a couple of generations before it percolates up and becomes common knowledge, like other areas of science. But I think once this becomes common knowledge,
Mhm.
there will be the creation of more humane policy, practice, law, and so forth. I really do think that that can happen.
I think it can happen as well, and that's why I think these conversations are critical. And um, another thing that came to my mind now that you were speaking about that example from Russia, I do also know, and I don't know, I think how interested it might be to study um, different places in terms of longevity of, let's say, an armed conflict, because I know from Bosnia, I know from Syria, from a lot of friends or colleagues, from even Afghanistan, how also getting to those parts of the brain that produce, let's say, art or creativity have also been so critical to their survival after a point.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because you do have to think about survival and that physical thing and the food, or if you have it any. But then after a point, the most beautiful pieces of art or poetry um, have been created in the most unimaginable circumstances, which
Yeah.
then tells us something else about our necessities as humans. But I wonder
Yeah.
whether in some point this kind of goes, or it becomes complementary to
No,
try to do both.
they go hand in hand,
Okay, yeah.
right? I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
when we talked about that post-traumatic wisdom part,
Mm,
and I don't want to get too sciencey here, but
mm,
one of the things I did talk about in there a little bit is that
yeah.
the adaptive, everybody's probably heard of the response to stress or threat that we call the fight or flight response,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's when you sort of increase your heart rate and you prepare your body to deal with whatever the threat is. And when that happens, that shuts down certain parts of your cortex.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the thinking part of your brain kind of
Mm-hmm.
is gone. But when you are in an inescapable, unavoidably painful situation, you can't run and you're not going to win the fight.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain allows you to dissociate, which is like
Mm-hmm.
disconnect and kind of robotically go through the motions and do things that are compliant,
Mm-hmm.
do things that will keep you alive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also allows you to have access to the part of your brain that can create things. So when people are doing art or writing, you're dissociating. Fantasy is dissociation. So some of the most beautiful art,
Yeah.
some of the most creative art and most creative thinking has
Yeah.
come from people who are able to dissociate. And often their ability to dissociate is related to their previous history of exposure to trauma. And so, I don't think you can look at, some of the great works of art, some of the great writers, some of the most creative people, they all have had things happen that have been heartbreaking. There's been loss. There's been, they've been immersed in, warfare. Many of them have been displaced peoples. It's, I think exactly what you're saying is important. And
Yeah.
it's also for me, the part about that is that it's such a hopeful element of the human condition, is that
Mhm.
out of the midst of all of this terrible stuff that we can do to each other, there are these slivers of beauty and art, and the most humane parts of us emerge no matter what.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm so glad that I'll be able to read about this in your book when it comes out, so that we could keep talking about it. So then, if trauma at any age could cause these symptoms that we call PTSD, which you mentioned, uh, I was surprised to hear or to read that the majority of the long-term effects do not manifest as PTSD.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about it? Because that's also,
Yeah.
it's important to talk about it, because yeah, tell us more.
So back to the first part of our conversation. We have all these systems in our body, including our brain, that help us respond to stressors. And we don't just have one stress response system. We have a lot. So in one individual, it may be that they have the genetic vulnerability, that they have a history of, cardiac disease, for example. And so if they get stressed and they have these developmental stressors, they're going to probably exhibit cardiovascular risk. Whereas the mental health systems, the systems involved in traditional mental health may not be as easily overwhelmed in them. So the way you manifest your body's adaptations and the way you manifest the effects of these traumatic experiences will be influenced by your genetics, by the presence of other people or other buffering factors. It can be tremendously influenced by your belief system. And then the other thing that's very interesting is that it's very culturally specific. So in the United States, we pathologize everything. It's like, oh, it's pathological. But in other cultures, they're like, they know that, of course, if somebody has a parent killed in front of them, that they're going to feel bad. That doesn't mean that they're mentally ill. That means that they feel bad. So let's do what we can to make them feel better. And it's interesting. In the United States, there was an event in World War II where, after the Japanese took in the Philippines, there was a Bataan and Corregidor with these little islands, and there were a lot of American captives that were captured and then had this very tortuous long hike to a prison camp. And it wasn't a hike, it was it was like, I think it was 80 miles or something, but they had no food, no water, and they call it the Bataan Death March. And then there were survivors after 4 years of being in a prison camp. Now, you would think, because they had horrible traumatic experiences, if you look at how many of them came back and had symptoms, they all had symptoms. They all had sleep problems. They all had what we would label as mental health problems. Many of them met criterion for PTSD, but none of them, really not none of them, but almost none of them sought mental health help, because they went back to their communities, and their communities embraced them. And they knew that once in a while they might drink a little bit too much. Once in a while they'd be a little bit isolated. Once in a while they'd be moody. And so the community was aware of the mental health manifestations of this horrible experience. And I think that helped them tolerate some of this stuff. So I do think that, if you look at the developmental effects of trauma, some of them will manifest as classic post-traumatic stress disorder, but a lot of them will manifest in other ways. Maybe learning challenges, relationship challenges, difficulties with just sort of regulating impulsivity that's not necessarily clinical level. And then a lot of the manifestations are around physical health. So, but I'm rambling. So anyway.
No. I think this is really important, because I think there is like a spectrum of extremes that I have noticed, in the sense that either PTSD is overused as a default of what must happen, or in some cases it is not even acknowledged as a possibility, because it is so wrongly, in my opinion, taken as, well, nothing happened, or he'll be okay. I think those extremes are what is worrisome, or what could be worrisome because of both missed opportunities to help somebody and right. I mean, that's at least what I noticed. But you
No,
mentioned,
Riada, you're exactly right. I mean, that's what we, and again, this is interesting because we read a little bit about it in this book, and I read a lot about it in another book. But
okay.
if you use the DSM lens, right? If you use that pathology lens,
Mhm.
then you're going to find that like 18% of the people meet criterion for PTSD. But there's
Mhm.
all kinds of other people that have problems
Mhm.
that aren't that label.
Mhm.
So I think if you're adhering to that perspective, you're going to say, oh, you know, these disastrous things only impact 20% of the population. But
Mhm.
that's just not true. If you sort of
Mhm.
add in all of the potential negative impacts,
Mhm.
anybody who goes through these experiences is going to have some risk. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad or pathology, but it's increases their risk.
Mhm.
And then coupled with that, just like you say, there are going to be all kinds of people that will minimize it.
Mhm.
And I think that the reason we've sort of abandoned the DSM
Mhm.
is that we think that it's like looking at this problem with blinders on, that it doesn't allow you to see the full scope of impact like we were
Exactly.
talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, if we speak about trauma and PTSD again, the part in the book that I found really important was talking about historical trauma.
Yeah,
And you and Oprah very powerfully speak about African Americans in your book, and you tell us how we absorb things from previous generation and how we pass them to next generation. And
yeah,
you did mention now both genes and family and community. And that said, I I mean, I'm Bosniak, and I did mention Bosnian genocide and the waves of violence and extermination attempts that my people have gone through history. So, and again, I do also want to acknowledge people and colleagues from the Middle East, from Syria, that I know or whom I engage with, who continue advocating those for advocate for plight of Uyghurs now in China. And I'm talking about historical traumas that we that a lot of people have inherited, a lot of ones that are being created at the moment.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
wish if you could explain to our audience a little bit about epigenetic factors in addition
Sure.
to those heritable genetics
Yeah,
related to stress regulation.
yeah. Um, One of the really unique qualities of our species is our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And the human brain has the ability to really be more adaptable than any other organ, probably than any other species. I mean, it just is so remarkably adaptive, so that human beings um, have multiple mechanisms to adapt to whatever environment that they are born into.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most powerful components of this adaptability, and this occurs in other mammalian and other species, but uh, and it's I'm trying to think of the easiest way to explain this.
Mm-hmm.
If I could look at every cell in your body,
Mm-hmm.
Riada, the same DNA would be in every cell.
Mm-hmm.
So if I looked at a heart cell, the same DNA would be in your heart cell as in a brain cell. But what your brain cell looks like and what it's doing is very different than what your heart cell is doing. And so all these different parts of you have the same DNA in each cell, but different parts of the DNA are turned on and different parts are turned off.
Mm-hmm.
And that's controlled by what we call epigenetic factors. Epi means on top of. So
Mm-hmm.
your chromosomes are basically coils of DNA that have proteins and other chemical things on them,
Mm-hmm.
which are signals that say, all right, turn this gene on. You're going to be a muscle cell. So you got to make a lot of this. You got to make a lot of actin and myosin, and you don't need to make any of this norepinephrine stuff. And then in the brain, you've got other signals that say you got to make a lot of epinephrine, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't need to make any actin in well, maybe a little bit, but for microtubules, for those of you who care. But anyway, you just get different signals. Now, the way these epigenetic factors get their signals to turn on or off comes from external input, from hormones and from patterns of neurotransmitter activation. And these factors in turn are influenced by the experience of the person. So if the person has a lot of stress and distress, that sends a certain pattern of hormonal and neurotransmitter activation, which changes how the epigenetic factors turn on or turn off certain things, all in service of keeping you alive under the stressful situations. Now, it just so happens that all that process that's going on in your brain and in your heart and in your body is also going on in the cells that are, that your gametes, your sperm cells and your egg cells. So if your great grandparent had a lot of stress because there was active genocide and they tried to stay alive and there was chaos and threat, his body would have made adaptations to help him stay alive. And then once he had your grandparent would have inherited that set of signals about what to turn on and what to turn off. And if there was now your grandfather may not have had the same pattern of experience, but he didn't need as much. So just a tiny little bit of stressor for him would reinforce that. And that could go from generation to generation to generation. Now, the good news is that we can reverse that, right? So if, you are going to have a little bit more predictability, maybe a little bit more consistency. And so the environment you provide for your kids, even though they may have the epigenetic makeup to be really highly adaptable for a chaotic environment, pretty soon their brain's going to, and the signals they get from the world are going to say, you don't need to be all tuned up. You can take it down a notch. And so then their kids will be able to take it down another notch. And so in the same way that there can be this transgenerational ramping up of these systems, there can be a transgenerational ramping down of these systems.
That's so amazing. And so good to know in the sense that, okay, so genes do not change. So we know that, but, and we know what can be transmitted, but what you said, and often what I think, both in terms of, okay, I think about the current environment where I'm in the United States. I have obviously a lot of my family in Bosnia right now, and they're all quote unquote living normal lives, except there's always political tension, and they all carry all this baggage that they didn't choose and that they don't want to transfer to their kids. But it leads me back to, again, that conversation about environments, and as you say, how it can change and how much we have to work on creating environments of safety so that we can allow these kids and future generations to not carry as much burden, because it takes so much time to create this balance for them.
Here's the good news, Riada. The good news is, goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that it's almost impossible for the entire life of a person to create safety, predictability, because the life is full of junk. But here's the good news. Remember what we said about the first couple of months of life? If during that time, even if there's all kinds of stuff going on, make sure we take care of the young parents. Let's make them feel safe and regulated so they can create this safe, regulated environment for their children. That's the most critical time for some of these changes to take place. So if you provide consistent, predictable, nurturing environments for young families who have young kids, and do that for 6 months, if we create policy practice that protects young families, that is going to be able to overcome more rapidly all of our transgenerational crap, and it will help these kids buffer the crap world that we're going to send them out into. That we can protect them. We'll do our very best for a little while, but the reality is things will break through, and there's going to be crappy public schools, and there's going to be bullies, and it's going to happen. But if they're incubated in love and
Mhm.
consistency and predictability, they'll build the neurobiological capacity to demonstrate resilience for a long period of time. And that's, for me, that's why I think policy
Yep.
around early childhood is really the key to solving a lot of these problems.
Mm.
Now it's important to care for people that are teens and older folks that have trauma and help take care of them, of course. But the secret sauce for humanity is early childhood. And I think if we focus on that, we're going to make a lot of progress.
And what comes to my mind when I hear this is also how both your information that you're giving us right now is important to know generally, but then how also it will impact the conversations locally in terms of each country having to maybe provide a different thing. For example, in the United States, we're like talking about parental leave almost. So, first that in
Exactly.
other country,
Yeah.
it will be, well, physical security. How do we stop war and why this is important, etc. So just the different policies that different policymakers would have to make if they keep on having the well-being of citizens in mind while having this information is what seems that will be going to make these conversations move forward. But now that we know about the impact of stress and trauma on the brain, and you have told us a little bit about healing from trauma, tell us about that regulate, relate, and reason thing
Yeah.
that really, when I talk to my 4-year-old now, I know what I need to do and what I don't need to do in a particular moment, and it works. It
Yeah.
really works. I
Yeah.
am now much more aware of why I have to just let him regulate himself a little bit before I get a chance to give him a moral of the story. And
Exactly.
even with my relationship with my husband, like myself too. So tell our listeners about that regulate, relate, and reason pattern.
So again, if you envision the upside down triangle brain,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I think we all learned this in elementary school, but it doesn't really stick.
Okay.
But I think we all know that vision comes into the brain separately from hearing, right? So your ears go into one part of the brain, and when somebody touches you, it goes into a different part of the brain. But the key is that all of that sensory input from the outside world, it's like when you and I are talking, the first part of my brain that gets to process this interaction is the lowest, dumbest part of my brain, the reactive part of my brain. And then once my reactive part of my brain kind of reads the signals that, oh, she's smiling and she's giving me good nonverbal signals that she understands, then it goes up to the emotional part of my brain. And my emotional part of my brain goes, oh, it feels good to be connected to somebody who's like-minded and we're having this fun conversation. And then it gets up to the smart part of my brain where I really process the words that you're saying. And so there's this sequential processing of experience happens with everything. So when your child's having a meltdown or your employee is frustrated about something, you might know the answer, right? You might know, the right words
That they're wrong.
Yeah, that you're wrong, but they're not even going to hear what you say until they're regulated. And so we always talk about regulate, relate, and then reason. And we tend to get that out of sequence, right? So we start talking to people that are dysregulated, like, calm down, this is what you should do, blah, 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 blah. And they don't even hear it. They just get mad that we aren't joining with them in their anger or in whatever they're complaining about. And so what as you've learned to do, you learn to kind of just, instead of step forward and wag your finger, you step back and you stay calm because of the contagion of human beings. And so the more you can bring regulatory activities into your interactions with people, the more likely you are to connect with them in ways that will allow them to hear what you're saying. And honestly, let me just reference back to Oprah. The reason Oprah didn't hear what I was saying and process it accurately all those years was that she was doing 3 shows a day. And every
Mhm.
time I talked with her, she was there were thousands of people that were clamoring to talk with her.
Mhm.
I mean, her to-do list was like, call Paul McCartney, call Michael Jackson. It's like, what? It's like crazy. Why is she going to listen to Bruce Perry? So, so she wasn't in a state
Mhm.
to actually process and hear. And so as she later on in her career, when she had more time and she was more reflective,
Mhm.
and we had this opportunity to have, we were sitting over lunch talking about this, it was a much more regulated relational
Mhm.
interaction. And then boom, the words got into her head and she connected all these dots. And I think that that's, as you said, it's a key lesson for all of our interactions with kids, peers, partners. And anyway, I'm
And
thinking of,
mm, uh, another thing though, with as we emphasize now and as you do in the book, how it takes time to also not just recognize these patterns but also to create these new neural networks with this new set of association. One thing that I thought was so important is where you talk about therapy, but where you say that therapy is more about building new associations and making new pathways, and
yeah,
specifically the fact that therapists can be an important part of healing but it isn't required. So, I'm saying this because, again, I've noticed throughout years almost extremes in where somebody keeps telling to or advises to people, to crowds, to this, like, you need to get a therapy, as if therapy
right,
is going to solve everything.
yeah,
And we learned from your book and how that's not necessarily the only thing that will solve everything. And of course the other extreme spectrum where you don't need a therapy, or you don't understand that how that is a factor of help. So can you tell us about the notion of connectedness? That's what I'm also trying to
yeah,
get into here, how important
yeah.
that is.
Human beings have experienced trauma for the entire time we've been on the planet, right? And every culture evolved some form of healer or shaman or
Mhm.
mystic, or the holder of knowledge about health and wellness. And in the key to so much of the way human beings heal from trauma is the degree to which you are connected to other people in healthy
Mhm.
reciprocal relationships.
Mhm.
And the thing that's positive about connectedness is that if
Mhm.
you have people in your life
Mhm.
who are able to be present, who can listen, who can give you nonverbal signals that you belong, even if they don't say anything, even if they don't know anything about mental health issues, their
Mhm.
presence influences the physiology of your body. It quiets your stress response when it's overactive. It
Mhm.
activates the reward systems in your brain in healthy ways. That decreases the probability that you'll seek unhealthy reward like drinking or
Mhm.
smoking or overeating or trying to find
Mhm.
something to fill your reward void. So
Mhm.
the more you're connected to people,
Mhm.
and the more, and again, culture is a huge part of this. The more there's a sense that I belong and I'm with my people, I'm with my
Mhm.
group, the more you're going to be able to have opportunities for regulation and reward, and then ultimately healing. And
Mhm.
I think one of the major problems in our modern world is that we're so fragmented.
Mhm.
Many people experience relational poverty.
Yeah.
They're not connected to other people in meaningful ways.
Mhm.
And then our therapeutic efforts are dosed in ways that are not biologically sensible. So think about that. I'll give this example here, that
Okay.
the easiest part of the brain to change is the cortex, the top part of the brain. It's part of the brain that is responsible for language, for example.
Okay.
So if you wanted to change that part of the brain,
Okay.
and let's say I wanted to learn Bosnian, is that
Okay.
that's is
Yeah.
it, and
That's the language.
do
Yeah.
you think if I went and spent an hour a week with you, that I would learn to speak Bosnian very quickly.
Depends how quickly is very quickly.
Yeah,
Is
I
it?
wouldn't, it'd
Yeah,
take a long time,
yeah,
right? I mean, I might
exactly.
learn a few phrases and a few
Yeah,
words, but if I were immersed in a community where everybody was speaking Bosnian,
yeah.
I would learn it much more quickly. It would
Mm.
be more useful, and the brain would change faster. And
Mm.
so what I'm saying is that the
Yeah.
part of the brain that's involved in that's needs to be changed following trauma
Mm-hmm.
is lower in the brain, and it's a harder part of the brain to change. And so
Mm.
the idea that once a week you can go and talk to
Mm.
somebody and have
Yeah.
that change, it's hopeful, it's over optimistic. And so that's why the people in your life that you're connected to are the ones that will make the difference in your healing process.
That is so, again, so important to emphasize and to give hope to people, but also to make them aware that it's not one thing that can do magic and can make magic, and
Right.
that it's,
Right.
and that maybe it's, could it be also something that different individual might need in different doses, like,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, back to what we said earlier, that many people respond very well to
Mm.
traditional therapy.
Mm.
But if you look at them carefully, what you realize is they have other areas of their life where what they're learning in therapy are being repeated. They have connectedness.
Yeah.
Very few people who are completely isolated are going to do very well with just therapy. They need
Mm.
other people in their lives.
Mm. So then, is this all a controversial thing to say that, for many, the experiences, while stressful, will not be traumatic? Because there is a lot of people who think they're traumatized, but then
Right.
is everybody traumatized? Or, and I don't want to, of course, diminish anybody's
No,
experience, but how can we
no.
then,
Yeah, no,
like,
I let's use this pandemic, right, as an example. There are some people who believe that this is a global shared trauma. And
Mhm.
I don't believe everybody has been traumatized by the
Mm.
pandemic.
Mm.
There are people like me with privilege. I mean, I'll
Mm.
admit it. I mean, I've got a nice place to live and I can work from
Mm.
home, and I've been inconvenienced by the pandemic,
Mm.
but I haven't been traumatized by the pandemic. People that I work with, there are some that have been traumatized. Family members have died, they've lost their job, there's uncertainty about, the future. That qualifies as a trauma. So
Mm.
I think it's important, again, back to the issue about language, that we use this language in a little bit more precise way. And I think we can. It's one of those things where, like any conversation, I don't, if people want to say they're traumatized, I don't ever say, no, you're not. I just want to listen. Just tell me.
Mm.
And sometimes I might disagree. And if they're interested in my opinion, I may share it. And if they're not, I just let them keep talking. So.
But it does take a little bit of humility, I believe, to be able to want to learn and acknowledge, again, not just one's privilege, but the plethora of different hardships that that individual over there has, and to understand that, while you acknowledge what has happened to you, and I don't know, it's always difficult because you don't want to be a bad person, but I don't, it's a difficult
Yeah.
balance. And that's why I think, having somebody with authority about science also is important in these conversations,
Yeah.
so that we can learn. I think that, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting. You'll see this happen when there's a death of a loved one, for example, that sometimes people like to measure,
Yeah.
my pain's bigger than your
Yeah.
pain, or I love them. I think the dilemma is that you don't ever really necessarily know. And so I just try
Yeah,
to
that's true.
listen. I mean,
Yeah.
if this was so overwhelming for you and you're talking about it that way, tell me more about it. I mean,
Mm.
and then as they talk about it, a lot of times the individual themselves will start to reflect on, well, maybe it's not so bad, I guess there was a good thing, I did get closer to my dad. He just drives me crazy, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
And then I do think though that I think it's good to be precise about the language.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, again, if you think about the regulate, relate, reason
Mm.
thing, when people are talking about how they have been traumatized or feel traumatized, usually they're not regulated.
Mm.
And so in these conversations, if you can listen and you can help them get regulated, then you may be able to say, I'm not sure everybody is having the same experience in this pandemic, or whatever it is, or that, sometimes people don't recognize how lucky you are to have grown up in a safe neighborhood in the United States. And, when I was, I'm sure that I don't know anything about you, Riada,
Mhm.
but I would suspect that growing up in Bosnia, you saw, was not the same as growing up in North Dakota.
Well, like every Balkan story, mine is a long one. I absolutely always, because of that humility and humbleness, and that's a completely different conversation about how we maybe as individuals minimize our experience because we are so surrounded by people who have experienced so much. So I think that humility
Yeah.
is also very important in terms of also reminders, because holidays are coming in the United States. People will get together and hopefully they will be vaccinated, if you ask me. But that humility, when we talk to each other, and you did remind me just now in your answer about, as much as we think we don't have biases, how we might have biases and how we need to regulate them, or, well, I guess maybe try to be aware of potential biases that we might have, and not judging a book by its cover. And I want to just get this conversation towards the end because I want to ask you so much more, but I am aware of your time as well. There were three more questions. I'll cut to one, and then there's the end. First, tell me, how optimistic are you about what you have been observing in terms of the acknowledgement of this pervasiveness of trauma? And because you work with a lot of people through your neurosequential model, about where is this taking us in the future?
I tend to be a pretty optimistic person in general. I sort of think of it as realistic, because I have had real life experiences seeing systemic and public awareness change in a couple of big areas around early childhood and the importance of brain development. 20 years ago, I was part of a big public engagement campaign. People thought I was nuts. And then it became, like everybody, it became, mainstream knowledge. Same thing with PTSD, trauma in children. When I started studying it, nobody, I remember being kind of made fun of by my colleagues in academic forum because I was talking about this, and they're like, well, there's no such thing. But now it's there's more research, there's more credibility, there's more awareness, and so I'm optimistic. But I'm also realistic. Here's what I know is that power doesn't relinquish power. And so there are a number of structures and belief systems that will take some time to dismantle. And but I think that process is underway. I am hopeful. For me, it's interesting. I'm moving my interests more in the direction of what you brought up earlier about what are the historical, systemic, political implications of these concepts. And we do talk about therapy, and we have a lot of therapeutic programs, but I really think that the most important part of this is recognizing how this is at play in all of our higher order human interactions. Political negotiations, whether governments decide to divide or not, these things are influenced by history. And part of that history has been related to attachment problems and trauma, and what role does retribution and revenge play in decision making. And when you look through history, you realize, wow, trauma has played a huge role in world history. I mean, the whole World War I was basically a family fight about feeling minimized and not included. And so, Kaiser Wilhelm was like, I'm going to show you. And it's crazy. I mean, when you
And
start to look at some of this stuff.
and the assassination happened in Sarajevo in 1914.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
mean, but yes, and that is also because I agree with you. Why I put the title to this podcast, Dignified Resilience, because I think that in connecting those two very powerful concepts like dignity and resilience, we get to talk about a plethora of topics, because what is resilience in a particular context for a country, for a individual, also boils down for me acknowledging the dignity that each human deserves and wants to live with. So that said, I hope that I look forward to following your work. I'm really thankful for the time that you and the efforts and all the insights that you shared with our listeners and viewers. Is there anything that you would like to tell them at the end before I say goodbye to them as well?
Just be hopeful, and all the change that we're hoping to help create, it will all come because people like you spend time with other people, listening and being respectful and learning and keeping an open mind. And I think if we could only spend a little bit more time listening to each other in a respectful way, I think that the world would be a lot better.
Yeah.
So let me end with one quote.
Of course.
That's related to that. Abraham Lincoln is an American president, very wise man, once said, he said about somebody that was in politics, he said, I don't like that man. And then he said, I must get to know him, which was really this recognition that if I spent some time with him and got to know him, I would like him better. Or at least, I would understand why he's a jerk. And I think that that's an important thing, that when people spend time with each other and are a little bit open-minded, that it's so much easier to connect in positive ways.
On that note, thank you again. And I hope that everybody who listened to us will share this conversation, get Dr. Perry's book, follow his work, hold tight to those you love. And I look forward to seeing you again for a different conversation soon.